time. And Piki said thank you to your aunt for looking after the kids while you spent time with us on this particular session. Again, thank you to both of you.
Maita Bas, Chinkuya, Kia ora, Piki, tēnā koutou, katoa, e te whānau a whānui. Nā mihi nui ki a koutou katoa I tēnei wā o te tau. Nā reira, tēnā koutou, katoa. Greetings to you from the places where my mind, heart, spirit, and times body has been over the last 18 months. But right now, coming to you from the city of Glasgow, so Falche Gu Glasgow, which is the Gaelic for that. And huge thank you to all of you for coming, for staying up late or getting up early, or just having a normal day and coming to this at a normal time. It's just a real pleasure for me to be here. And I was just saying to Sinfrey what a delight it is to actually be able to not have to wait 18 months to 2 years before I see my colleague Piki again, who lives about as far away from me in the world as it is possible to live from Glasgow to Auckland in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm going to give you a bit of background as I share my screen and to the work that I've sent to you, but also to the work I've been doing on decolonizing multilingualism for the last couple of years. And as I come to the end, I'm going to draw Piki in as well, because there is an issue with the question of authorship. What it means to author in the global north within the academy is very different to what I've experienced authorship as being. And in many ways, even though Piki has not necessarily written the words of the short wee book that I have written, she was very much one of the key authors of the experiences that form a third of that book and have formed much more of the work that we've done together. And I'm using the word work there in the sense of mahi, in the sense of the wider work in the world, the word mahi meaning a broader understanding of what we're here to do rather than what we're necessarily paid to do. So I'm just going to give you a bit of an insight into the kinds of things I've been thinking both into the book, but also since then with my work on decolonizing multilingualism. And I'm going to take it beyond some of the things that I do speak about in the book. First of all, I'd like you to know that where I am in the world, and I kind of hope where you are in the world, it is Atua Whakahaihai. And that is the full moon. And that for Indigenous peoples, this expression has a great deal of resonance all around the world. It's a really important concept, and it's something that means in different ways in different parts of the world. Gathered in a work of love and law that is as old as time itself, P.G. Alcock tells us the linguistic terms used in the Southern Hemisphere for astronomical belief. The cardinal directions in South Africa in previous times were partly based on the sun, he tells us, as indicated below. In northern Ndebele, Bula ha Bangla meant east and Busuba Langlang meant west. The term for sunrise is Uku Fuma. That for sunset is Uku Jakinga Kwelanga. The word for sun or day is Ilanga. The references Alcock tells us of have been gathered together into one of the first ever works to look at how those who were not schooled in the naming conventions of ancient Greek mythology chose to speak of what they saw in the night sky and how to locate them when looking up, up, up into the pinpricks of light or dust or ancestors. Alcock charts a path and tells the stories multilingually and carefully and with an attention to languages. And it's such a labor of love, this book of the stars, of the southern African skies. And it's not unlike Brechtian Verfremdung, a disorienting book, stripping away the cognitive dominant framings of northern science and stories of the stars, and reorienting the world through the beliefs, customs, observations, and most of all, naming conventions in myriad languages of Southern Africa. I am lost. I don't know where I am. I don't understand my location in the world. And that has been long my experience wherever I stand looking into the sky and hearing the way in which the moon is called, or the sun, or the stars. We lost our breath among the hostile winds, says the poet Kofi Anidaho. Let's move from the poetic, the indigenous, the southern skies, into a diagram that perhaps gives you a different way of looking at my work. This is a project called Researching Multilingually. It was a £2.5 million project that ran over 3 years, 11 countries, 22 researchers, 5 case studies, 2 hubs. And this is the tidied up version of what I drew on the back of a napkin when I was trying to think about how we might persuade a really quite hostile UK government in terms of thinking about other languages or languages other than English, to take a punt on what we might find when we looked methodologically at law and medicine, at literature, at education, anthropology and sociology and political science, and how they deployed languages in their research methods. The rest is history. They gave us the money. It was a little like Apocalypse Now at times, as we worked across the different countries of the world to follow this research, but it's continued to grow and has now led to a number of projects that have been funded by the UK government, which are trying to take international work and to take indigenous languages, to take non-European languages more seriously, and see why communicating in languages other than the dominant global languages might be so important. In that first project, we were looking at what happens to languages under duress, what happens to language in times of conflict, pain, and pressure, how we break with extractivist ideologies of research methodologies, how we research multilingually in different disciplines. And we were doing this in the midst of what has been erroneously termed the refugee crisis, but actually within Europe, within Australia, and within the United States of America, has been a crisis of hospitality. We were also really concerned to look at language as a social construct and as a category. So to look at how we research interpreting translation and multilingual practices in challenging contexts under pain and pressure. So we worked from the Gaza Strip to Ghana, Zimbabwe, Aotearoa. We worked in Bulgaria as they signed up to the UNHCR Convention on Refugees. And while we were doing so, we documented, described and evaluated appropriate research methods, both traditional and arts-based and practice-based methodologies. And then we upended the normal routines of academic representation, giving control and voice to those normally denied representational power as artists from the global south. So we employed 2 artists from Ghana, a textile artist, a musician and filmmaker, and then a poet and playwright from Zimbabwe. And we failed. We failed at researching multilingually. We found it incredibly difficult within the dominant Anglophone, Anglo-normative contexts of research in the academy to research multilingually. We kept trying and we kept not managing, until we tried to do it as an intentional practice. And I think this quote from Achille Mbembe really, for me, instantiates why we failed. We should first remind ourselves, he says, that as a general rule, the experience of the other, or the problem of the I of others and of human beings we perceive as foreign to us, has almost always posed virtually insurmountable difficulties to the Western philosophical and political tradition. It's a little like me looking up at the northern stars and trying to see the southern skies and then trying to name them. We also realized that the way that we in applied linguistics and sociolinguistics, in linguistic disciplines, in disciplines of modern languages, and even literary studies, have looked at languaging, at the way we use and deploy language under the Anthropocene, has been largely extractivist. And my colleague Michael Cronin talks about it like this. He says we have an extractivist attitude to language, which we use as the fossil fuel of rhetoric, and we then burn it in the universities. We mine data, we codify it, we analyze it, we extract it. These are very violent metaphors on Papatuanuku, on Mother Earth. So we were trying to think about how we might shift from that, but also to shift from what Ngugi wa Thiong'o says of the dominant experience of the peoples of the global south: accept theft or die. And what we noticed a lot in our work was we talk a lot in the global north and in English about my language. I speak, I have my English, or why are you learning this? For purely functional reasons. It will get you a good job through which to extract more capital. So we were really critical of these paradigms within language studies, because we could see that within the academy is, as Pillay has said, a place of epistemicide, a place of the killing of knowledge. Because Pillay says the university is a place of authoritative knowledge, certified knowledge, it is at the heart of epistemic violence. It is where authorized and legitimate knowledge is cultivated, preserved and protected, but also changed. And it's largely for this reason that it's so important for me, to Mickey, to my friend and colleague, Piki Diamond, who is working with the Treaty of Waitangi, or Aote Treaty Waitangi, at the University of Auckland, because she is really responsible for trying and largely succeeding in taking forward a view of the university that will counter the epistemicide that has happened. When we moved into a context of practice, we were asked by our funders to take our work and perform it in the centres of world power. They wanted us to go to either New York or the West End of London or the Edinburgh Festival or maybe Paris. And instead we chose to go to the centre of the world. We looked at where the lines of longitude and latitude cross, the Greenwich Meridian and the equator, and we went to the equator and we started to work with equatorial epistemologies, as we called them, on a production called Broken World, Broken Word. We gave our understandings, our data and our generative themes to the young people of the Dangbe rainforest in Ghana, and we asked them to improvise and make with our work. But we didn't just ask them to do it as a dance piece, we asked them to do it by making English come last. When my white body turns up in a space anywhere in Africa, I am read in a particular way. People will initially speak to me in English, and we decided that we were not going to have that, and we were going to put English last. So our work in the production that we did worked in 18 languages, and most of the time as the principal investigator responsible for all the documentation, the risk assessments, the funding, the account transfers, and the breaking of a bank at Medina Market in Legon, was basically to not understand what was happening. And it was precisely from that insight, one which Piki had taught me, that I was properly humbled as a linguist and enabled to access worlds where the world was not transparent or coherent to me, and I might begin to have a taste of something different. So we worked intentionally, 20 languages, English last, and devising, improvising. Never quite sure what was going to happen next, what we were going to eat next, what we were going to sing next, when we were going to go to bed next, when the rains would come. The women in the local township and the parents came and said what they wanted to do was design their own costumes. So here they are designing their own costumes with what's now a small micro enterprise run by the women themselves. And we discovered that when we work intentionally, the rural power of languages will expose urban power. It will be opaque. It will need us to take more time for translation. It will need us to slow down. It will need us to accept that we are not coherent to one another all the time, that untranslatability is important, uncomfortable as it may be, particularly to those who are supposed to audit and account. But it will ultimately produce work which is more fully embodied by the people who are making it. And what we found when we looked at this through applied linguistics was that the dancers and the production ended up being more on time and on budget because we'd worked more slowly. So we'd unearthed a whole range of different paradoxes in the work we were doing. And I think this might be because decolonizing multilingualism in these ways is fundamentally about changing the human relationships of power around speech and language. To decolonize languages is ultimately to decreate primal ceremonial actions of cultural safety in the soft symbols of the speaking animal body of the human. It's not merely an epistemological or cognitive task. We have to experience it viscerally. It's also, I think, a part of what Conlibra has talked about, where the resonances of rituals like greeting and meeting and eating together, like clothing the body, like moving the body in dance, within modern cultures, these resonances are not vestigial, atavistic, but perennial expressions of enduring human concerns. They're not survivals of relics from bygone days. Instead, a bit like the full moon, they address the matter of survival itself, which has never disappeared from the arena of modern anxiety. So in this little book and in the short manifesto you've led, there's the beginning of a few steps that we've taken together within those who were part of authoring the experiences in the book. We look at the mind, the heart and the body. We look at what it means to not be able to speak for pain, embodied or emotional. And then with Piki, very much looked at the life of the mind and how we might decolonize the mind. Decolonizing the mind through learning the Mihi as part of the Treaty of Waitangi, because we all lost our breath among the hostile winds. The breath of the languages I spoke in the ancestry of my people, who were cleared as part of the same colonial enterprises that rendered Aotearoa New Zealand a country that breached its treaty for so many years, that sent so many people to colonize the Americas and also Africa and South Asia. My people in my family were also cleared from their land 6 generations ago to work in the cotton mills of Lancashire. They too lost their idioms, their dialects, their dances, their clogs amongst the hostile wind. Atua whakahaihai. Piki.
Ngā mihi kia koutou, ngā mihi kia koe, Alison. Ko tongariro I te taho tōku pāpa, ko Ramaroa a kupe te maunga, ko Hokianga a kupe te moana, ko Matariki te awa, ko Ngāpu I te iwi, ko Ngāti Parara te hapu I te taho tōku māma, ko Tongariro te maunga, ko Tauponui Atea te moana, ko Whanganui te awa, ko Ngāti Tuwharetoa te iwi, ko Ngāti te maunga te hapu, ko Piki Diamond ahau. Kia ora everyone from Aotearoa New Zealand, from the south, probably the furthest south you can get before you hit the icy Antarctica. What I just gave there was who I am, or from whence I came, from which whenua I came from which waters I have come from. They are my mountains, my bodies of water that replenish us, and the rivers in which move our waters and our people. And also Tuwharetoa is and Ngāpuhi is my greater extended whānau, our tribal, our clan. And then hapu is, the word hapu is also the word we use for when women are pregnant. It actually means to swell. But when we regard it in terms of peoples, it's our extended family. So it's that idea of swelling. Thank you, Alison, for the kōrero. It's so interesting listening to Alison when she presents, because I find new things every time I hear her. But I just want to talk about the mihi. That, what I gave you was a pepeha, and then the mihi is to greet. And it's one of our first stages of engagement, rituals of engagement. And the mihi, and she talks about the mihi in the book. I think it's the final chapter. And it was such an interesting journey for us. And I guess for me, it was just the norm. Everything I did with Alison is normal for how I am. The word manaki is so highly regarded, and it means to host, to care, to be hospitable. And it's a way of being that I've been raised in. So it is very much my norm. When I met Alison and I took her for a bit of a journey, and got her lost, and then we found ourselves in the mist, knowing that once we were in the mist, we were on the right way. That how powerful these ways of knowing and engaging people is so important and so needed, particularly at this time where things are just seeming to get more and more hostile. And the mihi, when we're travelling back, and from Chaz's place in Te Urewera, we had talked so much about her up-and-coming public lectures. And for me, I said to her, why don't you do a mihi your way? Because too often we adopt the surface of a culture without understanding the why. So here in New Zealand and in Te Ao Māori, we have, it's almost, I call formulaic way, which is what you just heard of how to structure. It's our theoretical framework of how to structure our whakapapa, our genealogy. But for Alison to do it that way would almost seem tokenistic. It would get to a stage of appropriation or misappropriation. So I said to her, this is why we do it. So instead of giving her the formula, I gave her the why we do it, is to make connections. It's so that people know who is talking to them, who are their ancestral lines that connect them back to the land, so that they may connect through the land and experiences with maybe past engagements with her peoples, that her audience can connect to her. So that's why her mihi is very different to what I did. Now, for me, the expression is more authentic when you come from a place of the why we do our culture, how we do it, instead of what we do. Ask the question about that. And I think, Alison, you said it, the philosophical and political reasons. You know, so philosophically we do it so that people know who's standing there talking to them. And then how can we make that connection? So for me with Alison, it's like, oh, okay, you're in Glasgow, my partner, and therefore my two girls, my twins, their father is Scottish from the Highlands. So we have an immediate connection to the Highlands. I'm also from my father's side, you know, as part of this sort of colonial rush to New Zealand, was from Sussex. So there is all of that sort of intertwined into giving or allowing Alison and opening up an experience for Alison that she can learn from, not me only, but also who I, being very kind of intentional about who she meets and who I give access to, because these people too, that people like Chaz has the biggest heart, but also so giving, but what they have to give is so precious as well, and that we have to make sure that not anyone is given access to them. So which is probably why he's gone deep in the bush, which makes it harder for him. Yeah, it's harder for, it's not, I'll jump off the airplane and he's right there at a university. I think that's more sort of where I'm coming from. I just want to talk a little bit about also my background. I don't usually put a virtual background. I usually am at home, but I just wanted to acknowledge I've just come off a whole day wānanga, which is it's not a workshop, it's going deep rather than wide. into some real ethical issues around Te Tiriti and the epistemicide that is happening within our universities. And this is at AUT, Auckland University of Technology, this is our marae. So for those who don't know what a marae is, it's like our spiritual home, our spiritual heart within our Māori communities that tells our story. So the pose that you can, I'm going to see if I can do this. I feel like a weatherman, a weather person. The po there are our ancestors, and then the tuku here are talking about the environment. And then up here is our core whaiwhai, and that talks about the spiritual teachings that come directly down through the people, through our elders. So in what we have been doing is bringing everything back to our marae when we talk about treaty, te tiriti. So that, and now this one is called te purangi, which is very interesting. We've got a lot of women in our po, which is unusual. You can kind of see just right there, our centre po, which we call the po toko manawa, is manawa means heart. So it's the central post, and that's the stories of where our heart lies. And this is a wahine, hene te iwa iwa, some say, and she is actually holding a baby, and the umbilical goes down into the ground. And then above it, two male figures, which talks about the protection needed. So there are some really strong, bringing it back to this place as a microcosm of how our world, how we understand the world, and starting to use our whare as a teaching space to be able to talk from this space and teach our non-Māori, our allied staff, about how to engage with Māori people, or tangata whenua of Aotearoa. I think that's...
Kia ora, Piki, kia ora, kia ora. I think you can all see why I wanted Piki to come in and be part of authoring and telling the story, because this needs a very different language, it needs different vocabulary, it needs different nouns and verbs and names of people that are strange and different unless they're normal for you. And that for me, so much of the work of decolonizing multilingualism has been what I call in the subtitles, a struggle to decreate. Simon Weil has spoken about decreation as a struggle at the roots of the mind that you need to undertake when you realize that the ways in which, through no fault of your own, you have been created, you need to work to decreate. And that for me, therefore, as the person that I am, living and with the histories that I have, that struggle to decreate is of a particular kind. And I then bear witness to the struggles that others are having to decolonize or to decreate or to decenter or to deconstruct from different places within the world and around the globe. And that much of the time that means I need not to be a powerful figure looking on top of the language or the world and having mastery over it, to intentionally use that word, but actually to be lost, and to be able to acknowledge that so many of the ways in which we used to know the world, we used to know about language, have been lost to us, particularly within the academy. So before I hand over to Winfrey, I'd just like to finish with a little bit of poetry about this feeling of being lost. How can we find our way south? I am lost. You are not lost, says the poet David Wagoner in his poem, Lost. Stand still. The trees ahead and bushes beside you are not lost. Wherever you are is called here, and you must treat it as a powerful stranger. How can we find our way south? Ask the scholars of the North, beginning to lay down centuries of weaponry and thievery, and for some after coming to their knees in a scholarship of humility. You are here. You must treat it as a powerful stranger. East is not east, nor for the majority is it Bula Balanga or Ipu Malanga, and west is not west, nor for the majority is it Busu Balanga or Itahi Langa. It is a powerful stranger. Nor, dear reader, do I know whereabouts you are located to the north, south, east, or west of me as I write. On the spherical globe that is cartographized into these cardinal points, we are always dealing with fictions, even beyond the geopolitical locales or metaphorical thinking, which underscores the many new uses of south to characterize thinking, intention, and stance. My stars are not your stars. Actually, right now you can't see my stars because it's raining as usual in Glasgow. We're not actually in a tuarach, which is the Gaelic word for that 5-minute interlude you get between the rain in Scotland. My stars are not your stars. We're not under one sky. We are under our sky. We're not of one earth. We tend our earth. My words are not my words, and they never were my words. They are the words of my mother who taught them to me, and her grandmother who taught them to her. My words are not my words. Your words are not your words, but they are under the great stories of the sky. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alison and Piki. Let me ask a couple of questions. I think more to clarify issues for myself than as a reflection of what I'm not sure about. Assuming, for example, one publisher said to you, both you, Alison and Piki, that can you come up with a book or a research book entitled Non-Extravist Research Methodologies? What would that look like? What would you write about, for example, in such a book? But the argument so far has been, some rightly, against extravist research methodologies. But now you find yourself in a situation in which you are being asked to put together something that approaches a non-extravist research methodological orientation. What would that look like?
Vicky, do you want to go first or do you want me to take it?
You go first.
Okay, all right. Yeah, so a lot of it for me is about starting with practice and with art and with improvisation and creation. Rather than starting with a plan, a linear chart, a project management scheme, a book outline, a set of questions about which data I will get from where, when, it's actually in a much more lost place. It's so when I feel I am closest to working with non-extractivist methodologies, it's when I don't have a plan and when I'm in a room, often with young people who have a very particular way in which they wish to speak into the world or show the world what it is they understand. And at that point, it's about working together on what it is we might want to do. So for me, it's much more about enabling a space where work can be made, and then after that, engaging in a multi-vocal exegesis. So, for example, the dance project I mentioned that we did in Ghana in 20 languages, I have no idea who extracted what from whom, other than that we all put on a fair bit of weight from eating too much fufu. But in that process, it was additive, not extractive. In that process, we saw more knowledge made rather than me turning up with a recorder, sitting down, doing an interview, recording the stuff, saying, if you want to hear this, you can, knowing full well that the people will have real issues trying to get hold of a recording, download it overseas, all of those logistical material issues involved in that kind of approach. And that it wouldn't be theirs. Whereas actually what was made and filmed by the young people who also learned how to film it, was a series of dance pieces and an orchestral score that they made for the instruments that they wanted to work with, and a series of songs that they danced to. And all of that was additive to the community. So there are new songs that that community sings. There's new cloth in that community. They wanted to bring back the traditions that they'd lost of tie-dye and batik in the village. And so what we had was a bit of a budget for making costumes. And normally a costume budget would go to the National Theatre and they would bring their costumes and it would stay within quite an elite circle. And this way, the mums of the kids in the production were able to then start their own micro enterprise that they'd wanted to do for years but that couldn't. So for me, it's a wider question. It's like the additive nature of it rather than the extractivist nature of it. So looking at what it is we might want to make together and how that might happen. And to me, that's also where it becomes artistic, because the arts add to it. There's a making involved in that. There's a creative process. And that then the additive process, if you like, for the scholars, but which increasingly I'm seeing as something that is also done collectively, is the exegesis of what has been made, and seeing that done in a team where you'll compare what the applied linguist thought they saw to what the anthropologist thought they saw, to what the educationalist thought they saw, to what a dance choreographer thought they saw, to what I thought I didn't see, will look very different. And bringing those perspectives together then just means that you're not just seeing through that lens of this is the way this discipline has always done it, but it's also not strictly interdisciplinary either. It's actually enabling a bit of a dance of multidisciplinarity and trying to see what we might find as a result of that. But I don't know if Piki, you want to come in on how you see that. Yeah. I think you'll have different views.
Yeah, I think, I want to pick up, Alison, you talked about improvisation, and I put our word, which is more wayfinding. Which is, I think the movie Moana made so popular, but it's a way of being within the Pacific, that we are wayfinders. So that is about not us determining where we're going or us charting and pinpointing where the map is. And we were talking about it yesterday about how there's always a roadmap in our strategies, and at that institutional level, we're in a space that we can't see where we are. The mist is upon us and it's so dark that we can't see. So we need to feel our way, and sometimes just being still is what we have to do. And we go round in circles until we see a tohu, a sign that the sun, the moon, the stars, where we can navigate from. And I think for us, we're currently really deep in that at the moment with our staff at AUT, in terms of how do we respect and honour te tiriti o Waitangi. And the wānanga, or the gathering that we had yesterday, was to address that problem, because at the moment it's causing the systemic, well, not causing the systemic racism, the systemic racism is seen through that lens, which Te Tiriti has, because we have the Māori worldview and that West worldview, so Indigenous and the global North sort of perspective. But what we are trying to do is say, how can we work together? So when we work with people, we say, we are wayfinding. Myself and Dr. Valence Smith, they have found ourselves leading it, not intentionally. We're the people in the spaces and places that could make some movement, because we're both in central units. We're not confined to a faculty. So we are in those spaces that go across the institution rather than in pockets of the institution. So we were able to see what was happening all around, but there was no coordination. So in some parts we are the choreograph people, but our choreography is actually to hold the space and the people determine where they want to go. So, and we just activate where they want to go. We blow some wind, basically, if I can use that sailing term. And I said, our whare here is called te puringi. Now, puringi is the ropes that are on the sails that tell it which way to go. And that's what, you know, I find myself and Valence and we work in partnership to hold the space of manawahine, feminine energy, tane, the masculine energy. So we are always in balance. So we work like that to hold each other accountable, but to make sure that the energy is balanced within the spaces that we work with. So I think there is this wayfinding approach where we don't have the answers. There is humility in the leadership that we take, that we know that we're only there as a service to the people. If we can't help the people grow what is so necessary, then we need to get out of their way and let someone else step up. I would love for someone else to step up, but at the moment it's my responsibility, my duty. So I think that's where we're adding, and I can see, you know, the next gathering we're having is in the making. You know, we started the first gathering with all of our tangata whenua, our Māori Indigenous people, staff and students from the university, and asked them what did they want. And, you know, it started with our values, our Māori values that we hold in the university around aroha tika pono, love, justice, and truth. So it's around holding people accountable. If the university wants to adopt those Māori values, they need to be held accountable in the practice of them. So we delivered that yesterday to our, what we call tangata treaty, those staff that are allies to this cause, which we had just over 50 staff members there, which seems small, but at this time of year, we're coming to the end of our academic year. So most of them should be marking, but they're not. So they wanted to come to this space instead because one, they were sick of being on the screens, but two, they needed some healing themselves and they knew they would find it in this space. And I think that's an important part too, is the healing in these creative spaces that we provide and environments that we provide. And that I see it as our staff have been warriors and out on the battlefield. And so my ambition is always to create a space of healing and sanctuary for them. So when I get a chance to design wānanga or workshops, that's what I look to design, as places of healing, downloading, purging, crying, screaming, getting all that out of them, which then allows them to create when they're not in that sort of anxiety survival mode. That they remember why they are here. They remember who they are. And I think that's part of the wayfinding that allows the environment, when you design the environment for them to do that, they begin to see the signs, that their vision starts to clear. They're not clouded by all the bureaucratic management tick boxing debris that's floating around. So, yeah, I hope that answers that.
Try and explain what I understand you are saying before I hand over to Magda. So, your argument is that non-extractivist research methodologies are fundamentally unplannable improvisation in which research methodologies are analogous to spontaneous dancing. If I frame it like that, does that capture the idea?
Though I think I would come in and say that they are rooted in a lot of discipline. So there's
yes.
I mean, I love paradox, Sinfree. I just think paradox is at the heart of who we are all the time. So I think, you know, we are, to say they're non-extractivist means that they will also be extractivist, but not
yes.
I think we're extracting. So I just think we can't escape the binary.
Yes.
Yapa or text, as Derrida would say. However, we can try, and I think, you know, we're in such a fraught time just now. It's a really hard space. You know, my colleague Francis Nomjo at the University of Cape Town speaks a lot of the need for a convivial scholarship, and that we are in unconvivial times, and therefore for me, non-extractivist experiences might be a better way of talking about it, are methods of creating conviviality. Because when we're not afraid to learn a language and make a fool of ourselves, because you have to when you're learning a language, there is no way to learn to speak another language without making a fool of yourself. Full stop. As a child, I know I've got a 2-year-old granddaughter. The things she says in English and in Tigrinya, she's a Tigrinya speaker as well, are hilarious. She's making lots of mistakes according to the codified way in which the authors of the Oxford English Dictionary have extracted the pure form of the English that we teach to enable elite people to gain more capital in the world through language, as one of the things that does. But that need for a space of error, of failure, of repeatedly falling down, which is what you do, what you do in 2 particular areas of the endeavors we learn within the academy. One of them is the learning of other languages. Yeah, I want to see mistakes. I say to my student, I want to see thousands of them. The more mistakes, the better, because that's how you learn. And then equally, when I'm in the space of the performing arts, be it the space of poetry or the space of drama, how many times do you have to forget your lines to be able to remember your lines? So I think, Sinfrey, there's something for both Piki and I in the different ways, but actually the similar ways we're working, which is about acknowledging the disciplines of the body, the habits of the body, in order to be able to try and find a space within that paradox where we might do work which perhaps does less harm than has been done in the past, or at least changes the kinds of harm we're doing so we can recover from the ones from which have harmed us in the first place.
Yeah, I think too, you know, just to pick up on that spontaneity and extraction, and Alison, what you were saying around what we are extracting. For me, I'm actually, my undergrad is in visual arts. Hence why I always talk about arts, but it's also, I come from a line of healers as well. So when I create my learning experiences using curriculum designer talk, I'm wanting to extract from people is their wairua, their spirit. So it's calling forth, and that's where that spontaneity, allowing spontaneity is allowing to release the spirit within in these spaces, so that it can have a voice, so that it can be authentic. You know, we have these, you know, cliched almost words like being authentic, but if we don't let the spirit flow, then it cannot be authentic. You know, it's an appropriation, it's a tokenistic. So that's why when I did the mihi with Alison, I said, come from your spirit, come from your lands. The formula that we have in Te Ao Māori has a history that is bounded to this land. So we have mountains, rivers, lakes, and oceans. Now, some of our, and some of our colleagues who are landlocked are in deserts, don't have lakes or bodies of water, or some don't have mountains. So it's acknowledging the, you know, allowing that spirit to come through. So they acknowledge the whenua, the lands, them, you know, the part of our mother in which they have been fruited from, to come forth and have a space within Aotearoa. So it's, yeah, the extraction is more about moving the barriers and calling forth their spirit.
Can I maybe pick up on one of the questions in the chat, Magda? Would that be okay?
Yeah,
if I do that. Because I can see, Sibuswe Dube, you've asked the question, whose mind has to be decolonized, the colonizer or the colonized? And I love getting this question because I don't think there is anybody in the world who has not been touched by processes of colonization. I do believe that everybody in the world has a different duty within that, a different road to find or to improvise out of that process. And I was asked to do a talk on the book in Addis Ababa when it first came out by one of my Ethiopian colleagues. And he's known me for a long time, and he was joking a wee bit, but his first question to me was, so Alison, is this cultural appropriation? And I just finished his sentence, having done this a few times in the past, and just said, says the Ethiopian lawyer in the Western suit and tie to the woman from Scotland who has just been asked to wear an Ethiopian dress. And so there's a question there about where we draw lines all the time, whose mind, whose body, whose heart has to be decolonized, when it's very hard to draw boundaries around those things in any way that makes any sense when we subject it to severe pressure. So when I talk about the decolonizing of my mind, I'm thinking about the way in which the cotton mills of Lancashire were part of the colonial enterprise, and the part that my ancestors on my maternal side played within that. But I'm also thinking about the languages they lost. I'm thinking about the Cornish tin miners who spoke Cornish, a language which is now extinct, that therefore I can't speak, and that wound of language that would have come through in a world that valued multilingualism, but no longer does. So what might it mean to find my way back into families of those languages again? And I think for me, what's been very interesting in the work I've done around the world with refugees is seeing that process that I went through of recognizing the places where my language genealogy had changed were those that were in embryo happening for the refugees who'd just arrived in the UK or in other countries, where integration was all about them learning our English. And that was the sign of integration, rather than what we've been doing within in Scottish society. And I can see a really good question that's just asking me to be a bit more practical about what this might look like. So what this looks like in policy terms in Scotland is a project at the moment to see us sharing lives and sharing languages. So not placing all the burden on people who have come from highly traumatized contexts, and to then expect people to arrive and then instantly start to learn a language which is associated with colonial powers, with trauma, with interviews about how people have experienced trauma, maybe with deportation notices, with eviction notices, with detention notices, a highly codified language which is trying to extract life from people. Really a necro-linguistics, you might even say, of some of what we see. And for me, in the role that I have with the Scottish Government, which is to convene the group that is responsible for integration, we have said, absolutely, this is a mutual task for the whole of society. Learning from the work that Piki has been doing with the treaty, the biculturalism in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and saying, we need to remember our own languages. Absolutely. We do need to take care to monarchy, to give hospitality to the languages that are on the verge of extinction in Scotland, of Scots and of Gaelic. We need to bring in sign language, and we've passed a sign language bill in Scotland recently, because we need to make sure that we're trying to work for as much inclusion as we can. But we also need to enable people to walk alongside each other in different languages. So there's a lovely little project run from the Scottish Refugee Council where people will go to a supermarket with people who are newly arrived, and they will share each other's language. What's that? That's zaiti in my language. Oh, we call that cooking oil. What's that? That's shahi in my language. Oh, we would call that tea. What's that? That's bun in my language. Oh, we would call that coffee. So that there's a little bit of a meeting and an understanding that our worlds are radically multilingual and multilingualized, and that actually for the majority of the world's populations, multilingualism is the mother tongue. And that for me, the journey of decolonizing, the improvisation of decolonizing, is enabling us, again, going to the question in the chat, enabling us in the work that we do of decolonizing to create a practical scholarship that acknowledges we must work multilingually, and we do work multilingually, that we are standing on the top of multiple translations when we only write in English or only write in French. And that we begin to do that, not that we are perfect speakers of other languages instantly, but that we begin to do it, and that translanguaging, I think, offers us an approach to that, a way of enabling that. And what I was really excited about when Sinfrey, when the publishers came to me and said, would you be interested in writing a book and writing it with those who've authored the experiences that you've had? Might we do this in a way that is messing with the form of the academic monograph, messing with the idea that everything has to be purely in English, just beginning to break it open. It's at the start of a journey. It is not complete. It's the very first step, and it's one that has to be, I think, a collective journey. And I think that will then lead to a different phenomenology of multilingualism, to the one that certainly I have at the moment, which is really quite an activist stance, advocating and activating within Scottish society, but a lot of other places with governments which are predominantly monolingual in focus, saying we need to speak in the languages of the peoples, and we need to enable that not to be a site of fear, but to be a site that is enabled and that is healed.
If I can just add to that in terms of practical, for an example, and I spoke briefly about this around our value and them being aroha tika pono, and I gave some very literal. That it's interesting when people take our language, when the institution takes our language, even though it was actually gifted by our chancellor at the time, who was Māori. But what has happened was, in the translation, has translated, instead of to love, justice, and truth, compassion, integrity, and respect. So what has happened has been a redefining of what that is, and then a strategy put around it to implement it onto our staff, which is a misuse. Mm-hmm. And that's what has come out of the tūwanganga that we have had. And that, especially our one with our tangata whenua, our Māori staff and students, and the hurt that has caused. And it's a grievance on and a transgression on what we call mana, our integrity as Māori, our duty as Māori, who we are as Māori, to stand on it and to trample it. So we have put forward some suggestions on how they can correct that. And one of them is that the institution cannot use it until such time that they go through some series of cultural safety, learnings around cultural safety and what they actually mean, so that it's not just this relocating into a Western and changing it into a Western paradigm, and it's just fronting this Western, a facade, a Māori facade that is still locked in a very English paradigm. So we're starting to kind of pull back and say, actually, no, that's not good. That's not a relationship, that's an abuse, so we're not going to have that. And so, yeah, we're starting to kind of see how we can actually correct those unconscious acts that have been normalized within the institution.
I think, I mean, maybe also just to add, Piki's really lucky. she might not think so at times, but she's really lucky in that there is a treaty. There's a document, a treaty. Was it 1848, I think? Sorry?
1840.
There you go, 1840. I never got that I married an accountant so that I wouldn't have to do numbers. And there's something wonderful about having a document that you can go to and say, uphold this. And I think it's where, you know, for me, increasingly, I can see that the importance and value of legislation. So a lot of the work that I do within UNESCO at the moment is looking at, for example, the ratification of the treaty of the Convention on Intangible Cultural Heritage, where languages are an intangible mode and really important within oral cultures, and that will actually acknowledge that not everything we know is held in the pages of books, and that actually that's really quite a recent human technology. And certainly its wide availability is a very, very, very recent thing. And its digitization even more so. I mean, I was in college learning for my PhD when the first emails were being sent. So, you know, these are technologies we have. Socially, we've no clue. We are like stumbling infants in the ways we're using it. And anyone who's on Twitter or social media will know what a sewer that can be and how we behave like little children in that space. We haven't yet learned to use these technologies of knowledge well. You know, whereas there are other technologies that have been around for a long time, like oratory, like poetry, like art, like song, which many anthropologists will tell you came before speech. And that speech is a kind of singing, as Merleau-Ponty says, that great phenomenologist of sound, and that those things are perhaps where for a while we might want to turn and rest a little and recover a little and learn a little, and find these as places where we don't know what we're doing, at the same time as trying to keep the legislation rolling, trying to make sure that we have protection on what we find important. What I really have learned from my time with Piki and in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is that as a visiting scholar there, I come under the treaty. So I have to sign a document to say that I will uphold it. And having to sign that document for me meant I had to send a lot of messages to my Maori and my Pakeha, my white-skinned friends, to say, what do you think this means for me? For me, decolonizing the way that I might want to, for me, honoring the treaty in the way that I might want to, what might that mean for me? And they all got back and said the same thing, which was, you need to learn the language. You need to learn Te Reo Māori. You need to humble yourself again, and you need to learn the language. And through the work that Piki did with me, I went into the world of greetings again. And I'd come into those at a different stage in my life and realized how important they were to us. The way that, you know, whenever you walk down a sensible street anywhere on the continent of Africa, it will take you 10 minutes to get past the first person you meet, because you'll need to go, Molibaji, Nidibuino, Ekaino, Zikomo, Zikomo, and you've got to ask after the aunt and the parents and the broken leg of the chicken and whether the soup cooked. You demonstrate in the greeting what is in the old form of the word good day or good morning. You know, these old words, when you dig into them in the way that Heidegger did in his language philosophy, when you find their deep meaning, you realize that they are about wishing a well-being on all, in the same way that when you say assalamu alaikum, you know, peace be upon you and peace be to you, that is a greeting that goes and comes back. And that for me, in the greeting that is a mihi, that takes time to say, so this is my mountain, this is my river, this is my canoe, these are my maternal grandparents, my paternal grandparents, and then this is the story that I would wrap around them. What you do when you do that is you cease to be one, you cease to be mono, you cease to be, for me, the visiting speaker. You cease to be, in the context of work that I've been studying and doing within the Gaza Strip and within the state of Israel, you cease to be enemy and enemy, and you become someone who has a mountain, a river, a canoe. You become somebody who has paternal and maternal ancestry, and that then makes it multiple. And when you make something multiple, you give everybody the opportunity to begin to connect to you as a human being. And in that connection that we make through the greetings in language, we begin to do the work of peace. And for me, those rituals, those ceremonies, those greetings in a language are really important. So in earlier work that I did, I think 2007, I wrote a book called Learning the Arts of Linguistic Survival. And I was prompted to write this because I was quite angry about what was happening in tourism, where lots of people, particularly English people, were going overseas and speaking very loudly in Spain and demanding beer, or at least that was the story. And I went to learn tourist languages. So I learned some Portuguese and I learned some Italian and I learned a bit of Spanish. And I kept hearing in the elite circles of the academy, oh, you know, when we teach languages, we're not teaching people just to order a beer or a cup of coffee, you know. And yet what I found is, as usual in these journeys of scholarship and improvisation, as I spoke with people and as I learned new languages, was that we are precisely in the business, in a deep philosophical way, in languages, of teaching people to order a cup of coffee and to share a piece of bread and to sit at a table together and to greet and to eat and to sit with one another, because that is where we make human life together. And so when we become too snobby and we go, well, we're not going to do that like those horrible tourists, or we're not going to do like that like those horrible people over there, or I don't want to be like them because I don't like their accent. We're othering and we're othering and we're othering and we're othering. And my colleagues who work with me within the UNESCO chair, particularly those from Ghana and Zimbabwe, will repeatedly tell me whenever they're concerned about the fraught atmosphere around the tense culture wars we're fighting together at the moment, they will always remind me that the divisions that we have within our own society, be they racial or class or linguistic, also exist in their own contexts, and that for them, decolonizing, decentering work is peace building work, and it also needs to start by an acknowledgement of the other, often through trying to try on the words of another in an intentional attitude of peace.
Thank you so much, Alison and Piki. I've never seen that, but you just answered all the questions without me having to moderate anything. So that's brilliant. Thank you. The only question that was not answered is by Brad, because he just wrote, I want to ask a question. So just in case, if the people that made the questions, if you require more clarification or have a follow-up question, please let us know. And meanwhile, I will go back to Brett. Please, you can ask your question.
Thank you. And so I'm going to try to ask a question which has been forming throughout the presentation, and so it might be unclear and make no sense. And I hope that it doesn't offend anybody when I do ask it. And so the thing that I kept wondering about is, do you think that we can ever be comfortable reaching a point in which we can't find a way to talk about or to understand each other, so that we don't have to extract or reframe or, as you might say, like, exploit some sort of experience? And what would it be like? Do you think we can become comfortable with that? Can we let something coexist and not be constructed, and let it be dynamic and let the meaning emerge from the meaning of the two, rather than trying to explain an authentic or true meaning, or try to make that the meaning that all must recognize, or something like that?
I'm going to let Piki answer that one. It's such a good question.
It is a really good question. No offense, or very well asked as well. I guess it's what really struck me with the question was, are we ever going to be comfortable? My question back to you would be, do we ever want to become too comfortable? You know, isn't there always something beautiful about that uncomfortableness? You know, so it's all about expectations, I guess, you know, and it's a very, this is one thing, and part of the wayfinding is that it's a journey, and it becomes, and I think that's what Alison was talking about in answering whose mind is to be colonized, decolonized. You know, the coexistence of people. I think when you're asking the question, for me, we do need to go back to those primal spaces as well. almost pre-language that Alison touched on in terms of song and imagery. Like I said, I'm an artist, so when I'm making sense of what has been said to me, I'm drawing constantly to find the form of what is being said to me. And I'm seeing pictures in my head. So, and you know, I know not everyone works like that, but for me, I have to find that picture and that image that I can show the other person and say, is this what you're talking about? And then we create the meaning together from the picture. So it's almost going back to that primitive forms of language to co-create that meaning and that understanding together.
Yeah.
Does that sort of?
Yeah, I really appreciate your example there, because I think for me, I have a lot of trouble in the multilingual space, because for me, and you know, Makoni knows this, I see language quite diffusely. It's hard for me to actually conceive of language when I'm not speaking purely academically, because at some point you end up being stuck into that. But so the idea that we can have meaning without intersubjectivity strikes me as very strange. And so this idea of drawing out the meaning and being respectful of where it comes from, to me, is that still requires two. It still requires the outside and the inside, and to remake what it means every time it's reproduced. And so I'm just wondering how we can manage that. And if it's possible to, like you said, ever truly be comfortable sort of walking away and saying, I think I know what that meant, but I can't be sure, and I'm okay with that, and I can't tell you what it meant. I can only tell you how I understood.
I think it's such a good question, and it's such an important one, and I think it comes from, you know, within the academy, we want coherence, we want to understand, you know, and I certainly spend all my time trying to understand. It's my go-to place. And yet most of the world is entirely incomprehensible to me. And every time I walk into the university library, I know I'm really only going to spend time on level 6, and there are 13 floors. And I'm not going to get past one stack in terms of what I can read in the library in a lifetime. You know, the last person to read anything, we are told, in the West was either Goethe or Coleridge, depending on whether you speak German or English. And so I think, you know, there's no pure place to stand in this. And that to me is always really helpful. But I'm also finding increasingly the work of my colleague, Angela Crease, has been really helpful to me, because we've inhabited different spaces. I've looked a lot at language as a category. She's looked at a lot at language as a construct. And yet when we've been in dialogue together, we've all often been set up to debate this deliberately, because the funders wanted two women to have an argument. And actually again and again, we found we were just entering into dialogue and conversation, saying, but it's both and we were bringing in what I would call a conflict transformational paradigm, saying, how can we have language as category and also as construct? What would that look like? And where we've ended up really, her in quite an abstract philosophical way, I think, coming out of applied linguistics, and me out of a performing arts perspective, is to both start using the word repertoire. So that the question that there is there around, you know, is this similar to arts creation from the new materialist approach that Mari has asked? Absolutely, I would say. But that I see that, you know, the creation of language and speech in everyday life is this sort of almost subconscious creative artistic practice in the world. And how we go about that, how we care for words in a culture of lies, to use Marilyn McIntyre's book, that beautiful book that she wrote of philosophy, caring for words in a culture of lies, I just think is really really important. And the idea of the repertoire rather than of languages is increasingly helpful to me. So going into a space that is multiple, with multiplicity in it, and thinking, what are the repertoires here that we might deploy to get enough sense rather than to get perfect sense, knowing that actually most of the world functions really well on enough sense. As you will know if you've ever tried to order a coffee as a tourist in a context where you don't speak the language. So I think for me, there's a whole chapter in the book on gist and getting the gist and what it's like. You know, for me, in a family where most of the time I don't understand the language that the family speaks, the language of my foster daughter, who is an Eritrean refugee, when I'm with her family, I desperately want to be able to speak to her mother, but we can only speak to each other in gesture and the few words that I've managed to learn. And for quite a long time, my daughter was very opposed as a teenager to me learning her language, as well she might be as a teenager to her mother learning her language, and as many teenagers are to their mothers learning whatever the idiom is that they're working with, you know, the new text messaging or whatever that might be. Yeah. I
just want to, there's a question mark around the primitive, what I meant by primitive. So I just want to define that that's more, and probably the wrong use of word, but, you know, as human beings, we had these forms of communication, and oratory was one of the last forms of communication. So there were these, so not primitive as in, you know, anything negative, but actually a natural form of progression in terms of our ways of communication. And in terms of that relationship with academia, like some of this language is beyond me. I'm going to be straight up. I'm not a deep linguist. I'm actually monocultural, still trying to remember my own language. So I am, you know, sometimes Alison brings me in on these and I feel like such an imposter. But it's sort of, it's about the experience, but it's, when I say primitive, I'm talking about those, it's almost like those intuitive, tacit, pre-spoken language ways of communicating, the body language, those little gestures, those, you know, drawings, music, different ways in which vibrations of communications were delivered or exchanged amongst people.
And I think one of the things that we've done quite a lot for my team, and particularly in policy circles, is deliberately bring in these other artistic forms, or, you know, kind of more primal ways of responding. So maybe just to give you an example, I was asked to author a report for the European Parliament on cultural work with refugees. So I did what I normally do, which is say, I'm not doing it on my own, because we can't do this on our own. We need multiple voices and we need to model that. But also I said I'd like to bring my colleague from Ghana, who is a Ga speaker and a singer, and I would like her to be part of the presentation of the report in the Culture Committee of the European Parliament. And I would like to do it in a way that means that she will interrupt what I am doing. And that the members, the delegates, the MEPs, the members of the European Parliament won't know that this is about to happen. And so I was presenting my stuff, you know, with a tidy diagram that looked all very plausible, with nice straight lines and linear models. And then suddenly somebody stood up in the gallery of the European Parliament and started to sing, and sang in a language that wasn't one of the 28 languages of the European Union. And it was a moment of utter consternation. Oh, wow, incredible. Oh, beautiful. I mean, these gasps of surprise. In the 60 years of the Culture Committee at the European Parliament, no one had ever presented in song. In the Culture Committee, the one committee that you would imagine would be hospitable, we talked about, we'd not shown it in action. And then we moved together to do an exegesis of that, to say, if we're going to do cultural work, we need to do cultural work. If we're going to decolonize multilingualism, as I say in the book, we need to do it, not to talk about doing it. There'll be plenty of opportunity to talk about doing it in fora like this, as we reflect back and think, how could we have done that better? What do we do this time? So as we moved from doing our work in Ghana, and we moved into doing some work on the invitation of our Zimbabwean colleagues, or with a refugee group here in Glasgow on their invitation, to do multilingual performance and multisensory performance using these new materialist methods. We reflected and thought, well, we did that well and that worked well, but that wouldn't work here. I wonder if this would work here. And so we're never actually going to arrive. We're always going to be, I think, till the end of our days, actually laying something down A little like the wayfinders might, mark a tree or leave a stone by the side of the path that tells you which way to go. And others might find a way a bit further on. But I think this is just for this moment. This is as far as we've got in that work. And maybe just to come to one other question in the chat, which is the question of academic authorship that has been asked, and how is this wayfinding approach ever going to be acceptable as an example of good, rigorous research when those in decision-making positions, editors and reviewers, do not view such an approach as epistemological? I'm actually really seeing a lot of hope around this at the moment. The publishers that I've worked with for 20 odd years now, Multilingual Matters, are really, really open to this. They are really welcoming manuscripts that will work in different ways. They've recently published a manuscript by Adrian Blackledge, which presents his autoethnographic material on translanguaging in a market as a play script. They have published my own book. They're publishing several more, which are collaborations between artists, practitioners and scholars. And they're actually asking people who, a little like me, maybe don't have that much to lose in the publishing game, because we're in tenured, secure positions, to be the ones who break the mold so that it is safe for others to say, look, these people did it, and these people did it, and therefore we can have a go. And so Piki and I were in a kōrero just a few weeks ago with 20 of those who are in my research group, my research team doing PhDs, all thinking about these aspects, these questions about how we might put together authorship that looks at questions of decolonizing authorship, that writes about attempts we've made to do it, that looks at how we challenge the people who bean count and ask how many people have cited our work or what the rankings are in the journals. And that we, and I think for me, it's also been about intentionally trying to chart a course with a different publisher. So with a publisher that isn't necessarily one of the big global houses, that is actually saying, let's work with a family firm, let's work with a smaller publisher, let's work with people who want to have a go and see what they can enable, rather than what we all know academic publishing is these days, which is you do all the work of a good publisher, and you don't get paid for it, and you are expected to be really quite ruthless around what authorship looks like. And I think we're nowhere close to it, but in asking the question with our publishers in the room, our publishers are part of that improvisation and wayfinding and thinking that they're beginning to do together.
I've just, not so much probably on authorship, just also in terms of, research outputs and stuff like that, is the way that as people who design conferences, how we accept abstracts. And I'm actually going to share an abstract that I submitted, and it was accepted, and I ended up using it as a workshop piece. So it actually was the sort of framing of my workshop. And I actually submitted it just because, sometimes people say that, but we're so used to just submitting an abstract as in this academic form that no one actually does. So it's sort of sometimes put out there to appear nice and doing the right thing, but to receive it can be another question for those who actually want to review, when it comes to reviewing an abstract that's in poetry. But I'm going to just share that one right now.
Go for it.
She stands tall at Rongo's threshold. The queer calls and silence falls. Haere mai, haere mai, haere mai ra. Manuhiri stand at two's threshold. Woman step first upon his earth. The call is answered. Karanga mai, karanga mai, karanga mai ra. ranga, activating the weaving of time and spaces, of known and foreign faces. This is the dignity of mana wahine. Tangata whenua dictate tikanga in this space, manuhiri still to prove their case on two's open land. If they come as friend or foe, he hoa riri rānei. Before stepping over rongo's threshold, breath must be shared. Either way, we are hoa. So let's deal with our grievances at this threshold of time, rectifying where tikanga was displaced, where manaki did not take place. Instead, our home, our land invaded that saw her value in property, her worth measured by the pound, disregarding her heart, her true value as our mama. Whenua providing for us to reciprocate her unconditional love, her aroha, paying attention to her breath, to take care of her, to manaki papa tuanuku, to mana aki papa tuanuku, to encourage integrity so that she can live with dignity. This is her and our mana motuhake. Dear conscience of the crown, you wanted to dictate tikanga here with your man-made law vulnerable to corruption, but now our mother is dying, and with that, the people died too. And guess what? So do you. So, before our demise is upon us all, titiro, whakarongo, kōrero mai, kōrero atu, pātai mai, pātai atu. No longer shall we go head to head, taking this time for hearts to be heard instead. It's time to action, mana a ki, so that we can stand as one with dignity, where our words and actions are joined with integrity. Let the hearts, ngā manawa, take their rightful place, tuakana and vanguard of our grace, carving a way for its taina, te hingangaro, to unveil diverse truths of tangata Māori. So stand e tu I te mana o te wā. In this time of integrity, let us take our place as people of the land to host you, to welcome you into our world with tikanga derived from te ao Māori. Let us manaki, let us mana aki, let us mana a ki.
Obadia, Obadia, Fata Vana Vastaria, Obadia Monway. This newfound excitement about decoloniality is precious. It's easily critiqued. That's not exactly a hard thing to do as a scholar, not least of language. But the reinterpretations, the diversity of knowledges coming into view overhead is a little like blinking up into the Milky Way on a clear night. You are lost. Words fail. Then you begin to find points of familiarity and you give these names from where you stand. You are not lost. You are not found. Kia ora, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Dziękuję bardzo. So this is the end of our formal presentation. So I will soon stop recording. Just last words from Dr. Makoni. And afterwards, we still have 3 beautiful questions. If you still can stay for a while, but I would like to finish the recording and the formal part of the session. Dr. Makoni, over to you. You are muted. I can see from your gestures as you were talking.
Okay, I'm now unmuted. Thank you very much to Alison and to Piki for finding the time to come and share their experiences with us. And thank you to everybody else from across the world who has found the time to join us once more on this journey that is taking us where we are not very clear. What was very interesting about this presentation is that it reinforces some of the things that we've been doing. For example, there were a couple of sessions previously where we had poets, where applied linguists coming in to read their poetry. And then there was another session where we had one of us who is a musician who can sing, who is also a scholar of language and literature. So it was very interesting to listen to Alison and Piki talking about music, poetry, etc., and how all of them can be blended together. So in a way, what we were trying to do in a number of different sessions previously have been reinforced in their own session. There are a number of issues that which I think came up, which we may be able to focus on as we go on. I think the issue of extra-vis research, the issues of authorship. Another aspect that we didn't have time to talk about is the notion of work. What does it mean to say this is my work? For example, we may talk about that, I think, as we go along. And then there are a number of fascinating quotations from Alison and Piki, which I'm just going to repeat, which I think are very interesting. One of them, I think, if I got it correctly, is that we have all in to varying degrees been touched by colonialism, right? That it is naive to imagine that you are above colonialism and it never affected you. And then the statement, multilingualism is a mother tongue, reminds me of the statement which was made about 3 decades ago by one British anthropologist writing about Africa, when he said, multilingualism is Africa's lingua franca. And so another aspect which I thought was very interesting was the connection that Alison was making between the discussions about their work and issues about building peace, which I thought was very important. Then the last thing I want to talk about briefly is the issue of publishing. Magda and myself and Raphael are experimenting with what we are calling conversational chapters, where, for example, we have Alison and Piki's conversation today, and then we try and convert that into we capture the conversation that has taken place, and we do minimal editing of what actually, of the nature of the interaction, in order to blur the distinctions between a conversation and a chapter, and a conventional academic chapter. And we've approached multilingual matters. We'll know whether, for example, they are interested in what we are doing. I should say this to you, but I shouldn't say that. We also cited the fact that Alison is one of the people who is taking part in this project, and that they published Alison's work, the Decolonizing Multilingualism, to try and enhance the probability that multilingual matters would be interested in our experimentation. So Alison, there was some background idea why we wanted you to come. I'm not supposed to tell you this, but then I thought, no, I should at least be honest. Right?
I love the fact we're A, recording, and B, the mischief at front.
Yes.
I think it's the full moon. I think it's the full moon.
Yes.
Mission
Mission accomplished. Okay, thank you very much to everybody. Magda, it's up to you now.